Okay, so everybody, welcome to the second online CSS meetup. On the last meetup, Simon talked about Bootstrap, and on this meetup, Janko is going to talk about Tailwind CSS, and he's also going to compare it to Bootstrap. So it's actually a really nice sequel. This meetup is a really nice sequel to the last one. Janko, as you might have noticed, is also my twin brother, and he's a backend developer. So it is true that there is a good twin and there is an evil twin. So Janko is going to talk about Tailwind, and he's going to compare it to other stuff. So without further ado, Janko, you can continue.
Okay. It said host disabled attendee screen sharing. So I wanted to kind of share my experiences with Tailwind CSS because it's the first thing that really got me interested in learning CSS and design in general. So I wanted to show you its approaches and how it can make you really productive. So as Mateo mentioned, I'm a backend developer. I use Ruby for about 9 years now. I'm an open source contributor. I really love open source and have many projects on GitHub. So I haven't had so much experience with CSS until recently. So keep that in mind for the presentation. And if you're asking any questions later that I might not know some advanced CSS properties or things like this. So far, I've mainly used Bootstrap because it was just easy to get started with and it's beginner friendly. So I will be also doing some comparisons with Bootstrap. So Tailwind CSS is best described as a utility-first CSS framework. This means that it approaches building CSS complex components out of a constrained set of primitive utilities. Other names that you might have heard of for this style of CSS framework is atomic CSS or functional CSS. What I like is that it maps closely to CSS properties, which means that it's if you know CSS, it's easy to know what a Tailwind class is doing. Unlike many other CSS frameworks, Tailwind is a post-CSS plugin, which, in my opinion, it provides some really nice features. And Tailwind was created by Adam Wathan in 2017. So when I will be comparing things, these will be like the visual cues. So a blue background color means it's a CSS example, purple is Bootstrap, and white is Tailwind. So with that in mind, I would first like to start explaining exactly what does the utility first approach mean and look like. Let's assume that we are designing a vacation card similar to this one. In CSS, we would approach this by creating classes for different things that we needed to style, and then in our CSS file we would apply our styling. In Bootstrap, we would use a similar approach, but Bootstrap also offers some convenient utility methods that you can use, which are pretty generic, which then you can use in addition to your custom CSS. And then in this case, you don't have to write as much CSS as you would have to normally. So Tailwind kind of goes all the way into Bootstrap's utility classes, and then covers a really wide array of CSS. So in addition to something that Bootstrap already offers, we see that there are also like width utilities, font size, text decoration, color, and so on. And kind of the first time when you see something like this, the question is like, why is this a good idea? Why is it a good idea to style things essentially inside HTML? Well, for me, there were a couple of things that that I realized while trying it out. Is that what I like is that it embraces the connection between HTML and CSS. So people like to spend a lot of time on the chasing the separation of concerns, but the truth is that editing HTML usually requires editing CSS and vice versa. So they are interconnected some way, and Tailwind for me it embraces this connection, and kind of you are changing both, allows it to change both at the same time easily by keeping things in the same place. Another nice feature is that as your design requirements become more complex, you need to keep inventing new class names for different things you need to style. But there is just not good names for something. Like if you just want something to be a Flex container, then it's kind of, you have to invent a name for it. And this can become a burden, in my opinion. What's also cool is that this approach makes styling localized to the HTML that you're using. So it kind of bypasses the global nature of CSS, where you might be afraid to remove some rule in CSS because you don't know of all of the places in your application which it affects. So this way changes are safer generally. What I also like is that your CSS stops growing because you really rarely find yourself needing to write new CSS when you are adding new features, which can be really convenient in especially in places where there are only full stack developers, which might not take enough care to keep the CSS maintainable. So this is really a nice feature in this concern. What's also really useful is that design system like this has constraints, which means that it removes eliminates this paradox of choice, like whether something is 14 pixels or 15 pixels. You are kind of using scales and color palettes that are built into Tailwind. So you aren't wasting so much time in too wide a range of decisions that you need to make. When I first saw how Tailwind is used, I was afraid that it's not for me because I really didn't know CSS well. And Tailwind maps pretty directly into CSS. But to my positive surprise, I found that Tailwind teaches you CSS along the way. So I kind of expected that if I'm looking for how to use absolute positioning, the Tailwind will just say, okay, you are expected to know how absolute positioning works in CSS. But instead, Tailwind's documentation nicely explains what, for example, in this case, the top right, bottom left rules mean. And this is really convenient when starting out, and it's really beginner friendly. What's also great is that Tailwind class names, that they are much more concise and elegant and minimal compared to some frameworks like Bootstrap. So this way, when you're writing stuff, it's just much faster and much easier to read because it just chooses the minimal name that's needed to convey what CSS property it maps to. Another concern when seeing this utility-based approach is that if you're not extracting your styles into CSS classes, then how are you making things dry? Then you would just repeat patterns on different parts of the application. So how do you solve this? Well, with the traditional approach, you can extracting CSS rules into classes achieves some degree of dryness, but usually a component also includes an HTML structure, which can also change as your system evolves. So if you would have to duplicate the same CSS structure in multiple, the same HTML structure in multiple places, then you also have duplication. So that's why you would, in this case, you would typically use, you would typically extract these things into components if you are using React or Vue, or on Rails or PHP frameworks, you would use partials. But then you can just as well use Tailwind classes to style things as well, and you are keeping things equally dry. Now, components are definitely an overkill in some cases. So it isn't worth extracting everything in the component. And in this case, it's really convenient that Tailwind allows you to use its utility classes in your custom CSS as well. So it gives you this apply directive, which then compiles your CSS into the rules that we saw previously. So this way, even when you're writing custom CSS, you still benefit. You can still easily benefit from Tailwind's constraints or utility system. Now that we've got this the basics out of the way, I would like to focus on some main areas of Tailwind and kind of show you how it approaches solving different things. So let's say we can start with spacing and sizing and how it approaches this. So as when I'm writing custom CSS, for me it's a bit challenging how many different units there are. And I know that you kind of learn how to do this eventually, but depending on how you coach developers, you might still end up with pixels somewhere and RAM somewhere else. And people can use some weird percentages. And it can make your styling not very consistent. In Bootstrap, you have the utility classes, which give you some kind of nice, simple ways of doing some spacing. So in this case, we have margin and padding utilities, which have some kind of a predefined scale. And Tailwind takes this idea and pushes it further. So it gives you a much wider space of much wider spacing scale. And in addition to margin and padding, it also defines it for width and height, which are also really important. And we noticed that this scale is decreasing in granularity as you get to larger sizes. Because when you get to larger sizes, then you probably want to move in bigger steps. So, and another example is where that Bootstrap defines, it defines some utility classes for width percentages, and then Tailwind takes it a step further again by allowing you to use different fractions. So, because not every time you might want to think in quarters or 12 grid system that Bootstrap has, but you want to have like a custom, you want to think in custom ways sometimes. So as an example, I just want to show how you would translate a typical Bootstrap's grid system example into Tailwind CSS. So this Bootstrap code would translate into something like this roughly. So what we see flags and then the margin utility, and the minus before that, it's not a typo. It just means a negative margin. So it's a negative horizontal margin on both sides. And so this roughly achieves the equivalent of this. And we can also use Tailwind space between utility to avoid the need for the negative margin. And this utility just adds spaces between elements. And we can also, we don't have to use a 12 grid, like a 12th width, but we can use whatever suits our needs. What I like about this is that it kind of tells you exactly what it does. For me, rows and columns are a bit magical, but this tells you exactly how these elements are styled. Another thing that I find limiting in Bootstrap is that it doesn't offer fixed width utilities. So in this case, we have a phone number field. And okay, I see that formatting is a bit off, but in this case, we want the phone field to be to kind of predict the number of characters of a phone number. But that shouldn't really change with the device size. But since Bootstrap doesn't offer or probably sufficient width utilities, then people often resort to adjusting the width to be roughly the same size on different breakpoints. What you probably want is, in many cases, is just to make something a constant width. And Tailwind makes it really easy with its width utilities. If the spacing scale does not suit your needs, if the Tailwind default that Tailwind provides by default, you can extend it. You can add your own utilities, and then Tailwind will auto-generate the classes based on the new number that you put in. Or you can also throw away Tailwind's scale and just write your own one entirely. And then Tailwind will throw away its classes and define the system based on what you've defined. Okay, so now that we've talked a bit about spacing and sizing, I want to talk about how Tailwind approaches colors. So when writing in pure CSS, you have multiple ways to write colors. And what I found is that I usually need an external tool to kind of help me pick those values, especially because most commonly you would write hex codes and you cannot guess hex codes. If you're using SAS, then its functions are really helpful, like darken and lighten functions can really be helpful when you want to achieve multiple shades of the same color. But on the other hand, a downside is that it doesn't constrain the amount of shades you're using. So in one place in your system, you might darken a color by 10%, and in other case, you might darken it by 11%. So you probably meant for it to be the same color, but now you've added two different colors. So it doesn't solve this problem of constraining the color palette that you're using. When we look over at Bootstrap, it defines colors for some basic utility classes, or for some utility classes, which can be really convenient to start with and are usually like pleasant looking colors that are chosen. And you can theme them, you can change what the colors mean. But not everything translates semantically into these names that we see. And by itself, it's not really useful unless you want your design to look something like this. The thing is that most often even if you have only one primary color, let's say, you want different shades of that same color when you're making a design. So the way that Tailwind solves this is that it provides a scale, a color palette of 9 shades of each of the main colors. And then you would use this palette for some utilities such as text color, background, and border color. So, if you start, for example, with text red 300, and you realize you want something darker, then you probably want text red 400 or text red 500. And the colors here are really carefully handpicked to really be great for most applications to start with. And if you're writing custom CSS, then you can use Tailwind's theme function to retrieve colors from its default theme, which is really convenient. So theme here is just a post CSS function that then compiles into CSS. Just like with spacing, you can choose your own color palette. So then Tailwind will just define classes based on what you've configured. And what's nice is because this is a JavaScript file, so you can be much more flexible here, and you can define your own color palette based on Tailwind's default ones, which can make it really quick to define whatever you need. Okay, so next thing I wanted to talk about is how Tailwind approaches pseudoclasses. In Bootstrap, pseudoclasses provide you a way to style different elements based on the action that's performed on them. So you can change styles when the element is hovered on, or you can, or if it's focused. And Tailwind approaches this by defining a pseudo-class variant for each. It's available for each of its utility classes. So this means that you can start designing things normally, and whenever you need to apply some rule just for the hover state or a focus state, you just prepend hover or focus or anything else. So if we look at the CSS definition of these classes, they would be defined like this. We can see that colon character is a valid CSS class name. It just needs to be escaped, and then Tailwind uses this approach. And this can make it really productive to change things quickly. If you have your own utility classes that you want to define, which Tailwind doesn't provide, Tailwind provides you with a variants directive, which allows you to generate pseudo-class variants for your own utility classes. So a code like this would compile into a CSS like this. And that means that you can just use the variants in exactly the same way as Tailwind's built-in utility classes. Kind of continuing on this path, what I also really like is Tailwind's approach to responsive design. So when we are talking about responsive design, we usually mean changing how CSS classes are styled based on the viewport width using media queries. If you look at Bootstrap, Bootstrap defines for some utility classes, it defines versions for different breakpoints, which then you can use. And Tailwind takes this approach, but it prevents the breakpoint identifier on the beginning of the class. So for one, it makes it much easier to scan. When you're reading your HTML, you can really quickly scan whether a utility class applies to which breakpoint. And also, if you look at this example, we can see that it's not so easy to guess at which where the breakpoint name is added onto the CSS class name. And here it's really obvious. It's always just in the beginning. And unlike Bootstrap, it defines responsive variants for all classes in your system, in all of Tailwind's utility classes, which is super powerful because you don't need to guess or you don't need to define your own variants. They're all just there. An example of how you would use this is you would usually start with the smaller version, let's say a mobile version, and then in this case we have a list that's vertical for the smaller sizes, but then on the large breakpoint it changes to horizontal, and then similarly the list elements, when it's in the vertical positioning, then the list elements have a 100% width. But for the large breakpoint, it changes to width, to automatic width. So the way that these responsive variants work is that large means, or large in this example means, from the large breakpoint onwards, the utility class is active. So if you are defining your own utility classes, just like with Pseudoclasses, you can define responsive variants for this as well, using the responsive directive. So this CSS or this post CSS code would generate a CSS like this, and then you could use it just as you would any other Tailwind utility class. So when we discussed Tailwind spacing scale, the color palette, and then pseudo-class variants, responsive variants, and you might kind of expect, okay, if it generates so many CSS classes, then doesn't that make the bundle size big? And you're correct. So Tailwind's default bundle size is pretty large for any production app. So you probably don't want to start with something like this. The approach that the Tailwind recommends here is using Pert CSS. So Pert CSS is a post CSS tool which scans your files, scans your template files or component files like JSX, Vue, HTML, partials, and it uses regular expressions to extract utility classes, to extract the CSS classes that you're using, and then it removes any classes from the output that it didn't find. So for example, that means that you only have Tailwind classes that you're actually using. Prior to 1.4, Tailwind required you to configure Pert CSS manually, but from version 1.4, it's built in. So it's really convenient to configure now. With this approach, it's important that first, you must make sure to list all of the files which reference any of the Tailwind's classes. Otherwise, it will purge classes that you are using. And the second, you must not use string concatenation when creating class names. So in the first example below, like per CSS's regular expression approach, won't correctly detect that you are using text red 600 or text green 600. So you have to make sure to never interpolate Tailwind's classes in this approach. Now, in some cases, the Pert CSS approach can be maybe tricky to control, especially in large projects. So an alternative would be to use to reduce Tailwind's features. So after some fiddling, I came up with this configuration, which removes some stuff. So for example, for borders, you probably don't need multiple shades of the same color. You'll probably use only one in your project of a certain color. And then I'm not using, I might not be using some utility, some CSS properties, so I can remove that as well. And also, I can remove responsive variants for things like colors, because I probably won't ever want a text to change its color based on the viewport width. So we remove that as well. And this Tailwind config reduces the bundle size quite a bit. So, and which can be pretty acceptable for a new project, especially if you take into account that you will rarely need to write new CSS. So to recap, Tailwind's utility classes are great that they map very closely to CSS properties. Tailwind uses really smart naming that's concise, and it's really fast to write. It provides really generous defaults out of the box, including the color palette and the spacing scale. It includes pseudoclass and responsive variants for each of its utility classes, it makes things extremely flexible. It is built on post-CSS and offers convenient directives and functions for you to use in your custom CSS. And it offers advanced configuration based on JavaScript, which can make things really flexible because you can use the language which you already know. So here are some resources that I found really useful when learning Tailwind. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Janko. I have to say, like, when you first started talking about Tailwind, I was resisting a lot. But this presentation is quite convincing. And I'm currently redesigning my blog yet again, so it might be a good opportunity to try it. So now we have, now we can, Janko will take questions. So the last time we wrote questions in the chat, so this time you can as well. Just write a question in the chat, and Janko will answer them one by one. I wanted to, Janko, ask, I didn't quite catch when you add like a post CSS directive, what it compiles to.
So, like it depends on which. So, for example, so I can show you.
No, sorry, not a directive. Like when you, for example, when you want to, instead of adding multiple classes in the HTML, you add one class, and then in the CSS you add like the apply directive.
Yeah. So yeah, okay. it adds the corresponding CSS rule. So, for example, I will show you. Let's say that you want to apply a color. So let's say a text color here. you can see that every class or every utility class, it maps to a specific property.
Yes.
So then it just kind of, it inserts this CSS into the compiled output.
So it's actually not preferred because it duplicates this CSS, right?
It's preferred because I will just find the example. So this was the example. You see, this was the regular
Yes.
CSS, and this is the Tailwind version. So it's useful. It's useful that you don't need to think about, for example, the scale. You don't need to think about how many rems you want, or you can think instead of numbers, or the colors as well. So it kind of and it's if you are familiar with Tailwind's classes, then it's really convenient. It's really fast to write. You can just kind of put if you're not using any kind of auto completion, then it can be really much quicker to write. So that's kind of the advantage.
Okay, I think I understand. Tailwind, Bruno has a lot of questions, so
okay.
you can answer those.
Okay, so the question is Tailwind good only for prototyping and small app projects, or can it be used for medium-sized apps? So that first question, I think it's good for both. It's really fast for prototyping, that's for sure. But because of its extensible nature, I think it really scales well even for advanced use cases. But honestly, I haven't had those. Like, I don't know if I would call my application at work medium-sized. I think it's still, I'm still not kind of developing, it's still not pretty complex, but I haven't heard that Tailwind was only, I heard that it was good in any step of the development. So that's my opinion, but I would happily hear other takes as well. So the next question is, do I have to use advanced JavaScript tooling to use Tailwind? So Tailwind really nicely falls into Webpack, that's for sure. But it also, Post CSS can also be used without Webpack. So Tailwind has a command line utility that is kind of a wrapper around Post CSS. So you could write your own shell command to compile for your own build step if you're defining. So no, you don't really need to. I mean, you need to have Node installed, and you need to kind of compile your CSS. So that's for sure. You know, with Tailwind, you start with the CSS file, which then compiles into what you want. But yeah, it's not really, you know, in configuration files, you pretty much need to use basic JavaScript if you want to achieve something more complex. So I wouldn't say it's like advanced JavaScript tooling is just like, you know, I think it's the basics are fine as well. And the third question that Bruno had was for Rails development. And the question is, can I just use Rails sprockets, which instead of Webpack? And for those of you who don't know, sprockets is an alternative to Webpack in the Ruby world, which was pretty popular and convenient before Webpack came along. But I feel that Rubies are now often switching to Webpack now. So I don't know if Sprocket supports Post CSS. So whatever supports Post CSS will support Tailwind, and Post CSS is an alternative to Sass. So Sprocket supports Sass, because that has existed for much longer time. But I'm not sure whether it supports post-CSS. But since Tailwind is built on top of post-CSS, then this is enough. Unfortunately, I'm not so familiar with it because I switched to Webpack some time ago, and for me it was always better than using sprockets.
Okay. Oh, Antonia is on.
Okay, thanks, Antonia. So the question is, do HTML elements end up having lots of classes when we use Tailwind? This is true, yes. So this, a lot of complaints about Tailwind is that it's really ugly, that you kind of clutter your HTML with classes, and that is definitely it's a really natural initial reaction, and it is true. It is your HTML is much busier than when you're using a traditional approach. But what I like is that it doesn't increase the complexity of the HTML. So for me, it's just it just increases the amount of styles. But usually for me, when I'm reading HTML, I usually need to know how it's styled as well. And then for me, it's really convenient to have those styles right there in HTML, because there is not so much chance that I will remember, that I will learn what different CSS classes do, because for every component, it might be different. But with Tailwind, I found that I really got used to it, and that I don't see the number of Tailwind's utility classes to really increase the complexity for me in HTML. It's just, it is more code, and you kind of do have to get used to it. But yeah, it's it's really powerful for me. Like it just, for me, it was, the important thing is that it makes me productive, and I just needed to try it out to see whether I'm more productive or not. So yeah, valid question completely.
Yeah, like
okay.
There is one new one.
You're welcome, Simon. So Yakov's question is, what do you think about Angular's Tailwind combo? In Angular, in HTML ends up, so with Angular, your HTML kind of ends up with a lot of stuff. I personally haven't used Angular. We Rubyists kind of like Stimulus lately, which was created from Basecamp, which is the company from which Rails originated. So for Angular, I mean, I think it combines well with any JavaScript framework. So I think it would work just as well with Tailwind, with Angular. So I don't have personal experiences with that. So that's all I can give you.
Yeah, I think like with after CSS and JS, I think there are no crazy answers when it comes to solving CSS with HTML. So it's definitely I'm open to anything if because you have to always try it before you develop opinion, I think.
Yeah, and for me, like the localized styling that I mentioned, like if you are using React, then you have style components to make your styling local. And as far as I know, without React, you can still use CSS modules, right? To kind of localize the styles. But the problem is that in applications like Rails, it's kind of, these things are not really offered out of the box, or personally don't know anyone who is using CSS modules. Like if you're using React, then styled components are there, so you can use it, but CSS modules I don't know how to use. And then it's kind of, I mean, it's nice that it works in this environment as well, really nicely. But yeah, so it's a different solution. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Janko, a lot. It appears that there are no more questions. So, Janko, thank you a lot for the presentation. Again, it was. Sorry,
there is one more question. I mean, just because we still have time, so I thought we could answer. So, any big companies that are there any big companies that use Tailwind CSS? So the Diablo 4 website uses Tailwind. Borderlands 3 websites uses Tailwind. That's what I know. I've seen. Wait. Any big companies. I know that Adam Watson was the author of Tailwind. That he was talking about some companies on his blog. Let me just take a quick look. And search.
But when you said that it was it was created in 2017, right?
Yes.
So it's a really new framework,
yes.
I think.
Yes, it is. I will just try one more link. Yes, for example, I mean, not big companies, but for example, if you know Firefox Send application for sharing files, that also uses Tailwind. I mean, Firefox is a big company, but the Send application is pretty small, I guess. So I don't know at the moment of any other examples, but I think that definitely big companies are looking into it because it's very non-obtrusive way to start, I think. Okay.
Yeah, thanks again, Janko, very much for this presentation. It was very inspiring, and all the color coded and everything was very fun as well. And thanks everybody for coming and for participating. And I hope you will try it out in one of your next projects. I definitely will. And see you next time. Maybe I think in person, most probably. So bye everyone.
Thanks everyone for coming.